went and spoke to Kurt's class of students today. They were great. Then Kurt took me to lunch and gave me the first opportunity I've ever had to see frozen Lake Michigan. So I had to take a picture of that. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, and where they canceled school a couple weeks ago because of the threat of freezing rain. And then it was about 40 degrees and it rained. And I have two children, ages 5 and 7, and a wife who also works. And so Dad, with his home office, became Dad, the babysitter, all day. So very productive, I can assure you. But they were great. Thank you for inviting me up to come speak. I also would like to say thanks to everybody here at the Silversides Museum for having me up. Also, when I was researching this, Denise Hershaff, I'd like to single her out as well, for helping me out with documents and things I need. Peggy, who's been delightful, gave me a tour of the museum earlier today, and the wonderful exhibit on the flyer, which the Jacobson family should certainly be commended for that. That's truly a wonderful exhibit. And Don also, where's Don? For his wonderful tour this afternoon as well, of taking me around the boat and the Silversides, and on this lovely spring day that we had today. It was really quite nice out. So, but again, to start off, and I'd also real quick as well like to say thank you to all our veterans who are here tonight. Those not only from the greatest generation, but from all other conflicts that we've been involved in. And so it's thank you for your service and everything you've done for us. So to start out with, the book is The War Below, and it focuses on 3 submarines. And I'm going to walk you a little bit, just sort of some background on the submarine war. As folks know, the World War II in the Pacific began for us on December 7th, 1941, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese did not stop just at Pearl Harbor. Over the next 5 months, the Japanese would go on to take Guam, Wake, and the Philippines from the United States, Hong Kong and Singapore from the British, and the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, what we now know today as Indonesia, from the Netherlands. The Japanese even went so far as to attack northern Australia and make raids in the Indian Ocean. At its zenith in 1942, the Japanese empire stretched across 20 million square miles and 7 time zones. It was an empire that it had managed to build in just a few months. But it was an empire that was tenuous. It stretched across open water, held together by a string of islands, thousands of miles of vulnerable sea lanes, and a dependence on merchant ships to haul everything from troops and bullets to tooth powder and toilet paper. Fortunately, American war planners had seen the potential for trouble in the Pacific before smoke had even settled at the end of World War I, thanks in part to officers like Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who would become the architect of the American submarine war. The U.S. effectively used that time between World War I and World War II. Lockwood was a 1912 U.S. Naval Academy graduate. He was a champion distance runner, and in fact, he claimed the Naval Academy's 1-mile record at 4 minutes and 29 seconds. So he understood endurance and perseverance, factors that would be vital in America's submarine war. Now, the Germans had fought a relentless submarine war against the British in World War I. And after World War I, Lockwood helped bring captured German U-boats back to the United States so that our engineers could take them all apart and study them. The German U-boats boasted superb diesel engines that gave them greater cruising ranges. They had double hulls that could better withstand depth charges. They had better ventilation systems, periscope optics, and more importantly, they could dive faster than American submarines. That's actually Lockwood pinning a medal on John Biena, who was one of the officers, he's an engineering officer on the Silversides. At the same time, Lockwood and other submarine officers began to realize that and challenge the traditional view that the Navy had of submarines, which is that submarines operated best as coastal defenders or part of larger fleet operations. Relegating submarines to defense of the Panama Canal and American ports failed to maximize the weapon's stealth offensive potential. What other vessel could penetrate an enemy's harbor and sink ships? To take the fight to foreign shores, submarines needed to be self-sufficient, capable of traveling up to 12,000 miles, and carry enough food, fuel, and torpedoes for 90 days. It was through this debate that the modern fleet boat was born, including the Silversides, which is pictured here under construction at Mare Island. The Silversides took 473 days to build at a whopping cost of $6 million. which is about 100 million in today's figures. The Silver Lady, as she was called, is pictured here alongside the Trigger. What's fascinating is in the National Archives, they still have all the construction records for the Silversides are on file, and you can go look at them. And it's really interesting to know that the Silversides, when it was complete at 312 feet long, was actually an inch shorter than it was contracted to be built. So caused a little bit of a tussle with the Navy. So it's roughly the length of a football field, but it's barely 27 feet wide. And it had a top speed of about 21 knots, or about 23 miles per hour. Now, submarines in World War II were really more like submersibles than submarines like we have today. They were really designed to operate on the surface, and then when they came upon prey or whatnot and were going to attack, they would then dive. So they operated on the surface with diesel engines, and then when they would submerge, they would switch over to electric power. And submerged, they could go up to about 48 hours at 2 knots. At a maximum speed of about 8.75 knots, they would run out of their battery power in just over an hour. They had a test depth of about 300 feet, though in a pinch, skippers knew that they could go much deeper. This is actually the Silversides. It's the same image that's off the dust jacket, but this is Silversides off of Mare Island. Submarines were vulnerable to attacks from planes, aerial bombs, and of course depth charges. Most World War II sailors would tell you that you could actually hear the click of a detonator just before they went off. These are actually American sailors in the North Atlantic depth charging a suspected German submarine. It gives you an idea of what an attack would be like. At the start of the war, the United States had 111 submarines. Of those, only 51 were assigned to the Pacific, and only half of those were the modern fleet boats like the Silversides. The rest were sort of old World War II era submarines. And if that seems like a lot, you have to remember the Pacific Ocean is 65 million square miles. And more than that, you have to remember that to keep one submarine on station, it required 3, because of the amount it took to transit from Hawaii to Japan or Australia to your patrol area, and also the time needed for submarines for refit and refueling, things of that nature. So with 24 submarines, you're really looking at about 8 or 9 at that point that could actually be on station at any one time at the beginning of the war. Now, shipyards from Maine and Connecticut, Wisconsin, and California would hammer them out week after week, month after month, year after year, until they reached their peak production in 1944 of 10 new boats a month. All told, 288 submarines would participate in the Pacific War. And one of my favorite stories, though, of the construction is that, talk about Congress and earmarks and things like that, is that a lot of submarines were actually built in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And that's pretty far from the ocean. So in order to get them out to sea, what they would actually do is they would put them in these floating dry docks, and they would send them, just like out of Huck Finn, Mark Twain era, down the Mississippi. And did about a 4-day trip before they would come out and down by New Orleans. Still, the submarine force would be small, 50,000 officers and enlisted men, just 1.6% of the U.S. Navy, and only 16,000 of those would actually go to sea. Now, America's submarine force and strategy differed greatly from the Japanese, which started the war with about 64 submarines, so not terribly far off from where we were. However, the United States had experimented with various sized boats and designs around the time of World War I, but we really saw the time between the two wars coalesce around the fleet boat, like the Silversides. But Japan, in contrast, never really adopted that same type of theory. So they had a wide range of boats, everything from a 2-person midget submarine to these 5,000-ton submarines that actually could carry float planes on board. Likewise, Japan had no real independent strategy like we did. They never really saw submarines as these independent fighters like the United States did, but they still viewed them as part of a fleet action. They would participate in a battle of surface ships, which ultimately would come back at their peril by the end of the war. Now, submarines function a lot like a small town. If anybody's been outside on the Silversides, you get a sense of of how austere they can be. And they were really like a small city. Each compartment was designed to play an integral role. But make no mistake, as I said, if you've been out there, it's tight, it's austere. Everything had to be designed around mission longevity. The entire boat served as a makeshift pantry. You go out to sea, you leave Pearl Harbor, you're gone for 90 days. There's no Costco out there, there's no Walmart, there's no grocery store. Everything that you're going to need, you have to take with you. And so men stashed crates of potatoes, cabbages, and carrots in the cool space underneath the deck in the forward torpedo room. They lined big cans of sugar and flour and coffee along the narrow path that ran on the outside of the engine and bulkheads, laying a plank across the cans so that they could walk over them. They even loaded one of the ship's 2 showers with canned milk. Everything had to be designed around that concept of mission longevity, including the types of foods you took. Boneless meats were preferred because, taking the bone was just extra. The Silversides, rather than take big 2-liter bottles of Coca-Cola, instead would desalinate water, take Coca-Cola syrup and miniature CO2 tanks, and use that to make their own Coca-Cola. They knew that cabbage, out of all the vegetables you could take, stayed fresh the longest, while preserved fruits and jams sparked appetites, helped improve hydration, and more importantly, helped fight off constipation, which was a problem for a lot of submariners. The crafties, when you're out at sea for a long period of time, you would invariably end up getting weevils in your flour, and so you could, use a sifter and try to get them out, but the craftier of the cooks would actually they would just throw in a few caraway seeds and bake rye bread, and nobody ever knew the difference. So, yeah. One of the things I found really fascinating is the drum, which is like the Silversides. It's a museum down in Mobile, Alabama, and they pulled it out of the water because it's in salt water. But when they were, a number of years ago, when they were working on it, they opened up the battery compartment where the batteries had been stored, and in it they found about a half dozen bankers boxes worth of old records from World War II that should have been probably trashed once upon a time because they weren't the ones that are slated for keeping in the National Archives, but they weren't. And so included among those were commissary receipts. And so I went down there and spent about a week kind of going through them all, looking at them. And one of the things that fascinated me was, when you have about 70, 80, 90 men on board is, how much food do you have to take? And it was interesting to know that, for instance, they took 1,800 dozen fresh eggs when you went out, and that they bought food frequently in 3,000-pound increments, like beef, butter, and sugar. So it's just a really fascinating window into how they did it. Likewise, men lived on top of one another, and bunks stacked 3 feet high and about 18 inches apart. Others slept between 3,000-pound torpedoes. This is another guy reading a book there between the... Now, this may seem surprising, but there was no Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix streaming on board back then. And so men actually, to entertain themselves during downtimes, played games of acey-deucey and cribbage. The Silversides, actually, on one of its early patrols, put together a box full of paperback detective novels. That was its library that they used. Other sailors listened to phonograph records, Bing Crosby, Glenn Miller, Billie Holiday. John Biena, who's one of the officers on the Silversides, actually complained in a letter to his wife, he served most of the war, that he had served for so long that he had managed to burn through 5 of his 1,000 record needles on board. So that's a lot of music. They even had church services on board. But the mission, at the end of the day, was one all of destruction. I mean, the mission of a submarine is to destroy things. So each boat carried up to 24 torpedoes divided between the forward and after torpedo rooms. And torpedoes function a lot like miniature submarines. They're not rockets like some people think. They're actually small submarines. They have 1,325 parts and cost about $10,000 each, which, in today's money is about $150,000. $10,000 could actually fund the salaries of 5 Navy ensigns in 1942. They were powered off of alcohol, of all things. And so the Navy, knowing how sailors are, realized that keeping a bunch of alcohol on board was probably not the wisest thing to do because, sailors get thirsty. So they thought that they would spike it with croton oil, which, is a natural purgative, but don't ever underestimate a thirsty sailor. A lot of sailors figured out how that you could actually just, with a simple trick of taking an old loaf of stale bread, you could actually pour that through and it would strain out the croton oil and leave you with a drinkable alcohol. And then if you mixed it with pineapple juice or any other kind of fruit juice, you made what was called torpedo juice. Now, some of the sailors I interviewed said you had to drink it really quickly because if you were drinking it in a like a paper cup with a wax bottom, it would eat the wax out of the bottom after a couple of drinks. So you had to drink quick. And now, Japan was the perfect adversary for a submarine war. It's an island nation. It's made up of 4 major islands, thousands of smaller ones, with a landmass about the size of California. But mountains cover 85% of Japan, so it really pushes all of its development out to the coastlines. As a result of that, it also makes things like roads and railroads and things like that, all that kind of infrastructure we take for granted, pretty difficult. And so, to give you an example, actually, Japan at the start of the war only had 6,000 miles of national paved roadways. That's it. South Carolina, where I live, small state, we have 40,000 miles of paved roadways. So all of Japan's transportation really evolved around the water, and it was a vital maritime highway system that the United States realized would be a very great vulnerability for them during a war. But Japan's inhospitable terrain caused them other greater strategic problems as well. They had a critical lack of farmland. And not only that, their population had tripled in size in the years leading up to the war. Fishermen literally had to sail as far away as Alaska and the Panama Canal just to be able to catch enough fish to feed their population. And outside of a handful of industries, they had no material self-sufficiency. They had to even import rice to feed the population. These demands became all the more acute in the need for war materials. The rubber you need for tires, the cotton to sew uniforms, the bauxite that's a key ingredient in aluminum to build fighters. But none of those were more needed and more important than oil. Japan, on the eve of the war, could produce just 2 million barrels of oil a year. That's 0.1% of the world's supply at that time. The United States at that time was the largest oil producer. We produced 700 times that amount. And we sold Japan 80% of their oil that they stockpiled leading up to the war. In fact, the oil that powered their battleships, their aircraft carriers, and their fighters and bombers that attacked Pearl Harbor was sold to them from the United States. There was a great line, actually, that a New York Times article at that time that said, Napoleon's armies moved on their stomachs, modern motorized armies move on gasoline. And that was so true. Now, the question facing American submarine strategists was how best to go after Japan if you're going to blockade them. Remember, we have a limited amount of submarines, 51 boats to start out the war, an empire that stretched across 20 million square miles. So what the United States did is they carved up the Pacific into patrol areas. And you can see this is an actual map of patrol areas from the National Archives. And what they did is they put these boxes around the Japanese home islands, around the Philippines, and strategic places like that, also where major sea lanes converged at sea. And then they would assign a submarine going out saying you're going to be in patrol area 14. And anything you see in that area, you can sink it. We'll guarantee there's no other American ships there. So later in the war, our cryptographers would actually break the code that they were using in order to direct their merchant ships. And so we would literally break that, and it would say, for instance, there's going to be a convoy with 5 ships, including 1,400, cavalrymen and their horses are going to be going on Tuesday at this longitude, this latitude, and the submarines could literally just show up and wait for them to arrive. So it was really, but that didn't happen until 1943. So American submarines over the course of the war made 1,570 war patrols. And so to tell the story of that, and that's a significant amount, obviously, to tell the story of that, I was looking for 3 boats that would serve as a microcosm for the larger war. And I chose the Silversides, the Drum, and the Tang. Now, these 3 boats would make just 32 war patrols over the course of the war. That's less than 2% of the missions that American submarines made. Yet these 3 boats would sink a combined 62 freighters, tankers, and cargo ships. It's the equivalent tonnage of 7 Essex-class aircraft carriers. Now, to tell that story, you go looking for the records. You go to the National Archives. You can go and they pull the deck logs. They have which have the sort of the every 4 hours, the course changes, things of that nature. The patrol reports, which would actually tell what was going on board during a lot of the attacks and things of that nature. In fact, with World War II, with more than 10 million men and women in uniform, we had plenty of manpower, women power to write down all the wonderful details, including they would literally time when a torpedo was fired, how long until detonation. So you can go back and you can look at these records and you can see that they fired that torpedo and it hit 47 seconds later. So I mean, the record keeping on an official level was really wonderful. But to tell that story, I wanted to be able to interview as many folks as I could. I did about 100 interviews. But sadly, as we know, so many members of the greatest generation are passing away. And I wanted to be able to tell that story as well. And so I compare it to a historical scavenger hunt. It's tracking down people, their families and whatnot, looking for things like letters, diaries, and things of that nature. This is John Biena up here. John was the engineer on board the Silversides and for almost the whole war. Now, he died in 1976, the year after I was born. So I was 1 year old when he died. But I found an old obituary for him in which it listed his son. I managed to track down his son on Maui, of all places. And I called him up out of the blue and I said, I'm working on a book on your dad's submarine, and I know he's been passed away from us 4 decades, but by any chance did he leave behind any diaries, letters, things like that might help tell that story? And he said, it's interesting that you called. He said, my mom died last year, and right before she died, she came to me, and she with this box, and she handed it to me, and I opened it up, and it was filled with all my dad's wartime letters. And she told me, she said, whatever you do, hang on to this. Someday somebody's going to want these. And so about a month later, they showed up. And 311 pages of his wartime letters. Many of them actually, they were written on the Silverside stationery, which I know it's hard to see, but here. There were literally so many of them that I had to actually create my own index of them and organize them all. And that took them to Kinko's and bound them because my kids will knock them off my desk and they'd be lost to history, their order. But people in that time period, we live in an era of Facebook and Twitter and short communications. So many people in that generation were just these amazing writers. So I want to read you a quick excerpt of one of these letters. Now, they were in on one of these patrols for the Silversides, and they were in so close to hostile shores that the men were all worried about it. And so they were actually, they were standing watch. They had laminated pictures of their wives so that they, in case the ship were lost and they went into the water, they would have that laminated picture that would survive. And he said, we are in so close to shore this trip that I always stand my watches with my knife in my pocket and a picture of you, the one showing you in your bathing suit. That's the only one I've made waterproof. And if I have to go swimming some night, I wouldn't want to be lonely. The knife I'd use for cutting berries in half, hunting, etc., and of course to hack my way through thousands of jungles to have you in my arms again. It's pretty amazing stuff. He does kind of look like Leonardo DiCaprio. Creed Burlingame was the original skipper of the Silversides, and the Silversides was commissioned just 8 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and Creed, as skipper, would go on to sink and be credited for 8 ships, earning 3 Navy Crosses. He was the perfect skipper for the early frontier days of the war. He was from Kentucky, he spoke with a thick accent, and he loved to drink. So much so that he one time drank a bottle of Chanel No. 5. He thought it was torpedo juice. And he joked after, he had a good sense of humor, he joked afterwards that he had to fight to keep all the men away. So he also had a heavy dose of superstition, which prompted him to install the Buddha statuettes that you guys have one on display here in the conning tower and in the torpedo rooms. And he would rub them during tacks and depth charge attacks for good luck. And so, in fact, and one thing I read that he wrote, oral history did, he said he rubbed them sometimes on patrols so much that it literally made his fingers raw. Now, Burlingame's first action as skipper of the Silversides was in May of 1942 when they were on their first patrol. They left Hawaii. They were on their way to Japan. They were going to attack ships in the home islands there. And they ran across what we now know of today was Japan's early defense system. It was a line of picket boats, if you will. As you guys who are familiar with the story of Jimmy Doolittle may know, they ran across these boats. The Japanese were not as early of adopters of radar as we were, and instead they put about 600 or so of these ships, a couple hundred of these ships about 600 miles off shore to sort of spot anything. Now, Silversides ran across this fishing trawler, what appeared to be a fishing trawler, and Burlingame decided that at $10,000 a torpedo, it was not worth using a torpedo. They would just shoot it up with the deck gun. So the trawler, however, as he realized, turned out to be armed, and what was supposed to be a really quick battle turned into about an hour-long engagement. They opened fire. The Ebisumaru fires back. This volley goes back and forth. During the exchange, actually, a bullet singed Burlingame's right ear. And another struck Mike Harbin, a torpedo man from Oklahoma. In fact, he was one of the loaders out there, and his blood splattered onto the shell, onto the round, and his men next to him went ahead and just instinctively rammed it in the breech and fired it. He died that afternoon. He was the first and only one on board the Silversides to die. They couldn't go back. You didn't turn around in those days and go back because of someone who'd passed away, and so they took him downstairs and they stitched him up in a big piece of canvas, and to weight his body down, they tied a gun shell to it. And that night, when the waves calmed down and the battle was over, they buried him at sea, and his final resting place would be longitude and latitude, 2 coordinates on a map. And then they went on to Japan. Another one of the Silverside stories that I cover in the book, and that I think is pretty famous, is the appendectomy story, which happened just a few days before Christmas. Now, submarines in that period, as self-sufficient as they were on so many levels, the one thing they didn't have was a doctor, and they just couldn't spare them for that many folks. But they had what was called a pharmacist mate, or as the other guys on board called him, the quack, because to be a pharmacist mate, all it took was 12 weeks of training. That was it, and you're off. And the pharmacist mates used to like to say they wore a lot of hats. They were everything from the doctor to the chaplain rolled into one. So anyway, so the Silversides is off the coast of off of Rabaul in New Britain, which was a Japanese stronghold, when George Platter comes down with appendicitis. And so the young pharmacist mates, this guy by the name of Tom Moore, of course, he's had his 12 weeks of training, and but they're very fortunate that they've got Tom Moore, because before he had ended up on the Silversides, he'd actually worked in the San Diego hospital. And he had a little bit of an attitude back then, and so he'd actually, every time he got in trouble or whatnot, the head doctor there would make him help out and hand over instruments during hemorrhoid surgeries. And so, he joked that he apparently had been so surly that he had done so many of hemorrhoid surgeries that he had made rear admiral. But he was wise enough to realize that he might need a few extra surgical instruments, and more importantly, he realized he needed Novocaine, which was not included, and so he brought that with him. So he goes to Burlingame and he says, "We've got a guy with appendicitis, and we need to head back, drop him off." And Burlingame says, "That's not going to happen. You're going to have to do this surgery." And so here's this young guy in his early 20s with 12 weeks of official training, whose job it is to operate on one of his buddies, basically. And they did it right outside here on the Silversides. Well, if you guys have been through it, no, there's no operating room. There's the wardroom, which has a small table, which will not fit a grown man, unless you think about adding an ironing board to the end of it, which is what they did. So they begin the surgery. They go down to about 150 feet, and they start the surgery. And as you can see here, who doesn't like to operate without their shirt on? Come on. But it's really hot on board. So these are actual photographs from that. So they begin the surgery, and Tom Moore realizes he's got a spot of blood that's coming. There's a source of bleeding. He can't find it, which should be a 30-minute procedure. Ultimately drags on for almost 4 hours. And so at one point he's doing the operation, and he hears somebody saying, "Are you done yet? Are you done yet?" And he's focused on trying to find this. He's got this guy's guts in his hands, rolling through and looking for the bleeder, and he can't find him. And then he realizes that the person who's asking is his patient because he's woken up. And then he starts thrashing, and he starts dry heaving, and they realize that I've got to sedate him again. I don't have any more Novocaine. We're going to have to open up a can of ether, and on a closed ventilation system like a submarine. You don't want to have to do that, but they do it anyway. He, of course, gets sucked in the ventilation system. Patrick Carswell is one of the veterans on board who was in the conning tower. He told me about getting nauseous about it, because of the. But at the end of the day, he was successful, and his patient lived all the way up until his 80s. So. Burlingame handed off command of the Silversides after 5 patrols to Jack Coy. Now, these 2 men that you're looking at right here together sank a combined 22 Japanese ships. And Coy, in fact, would go on to be one of the top skippers of the war. He personally sank 14, and he liked to unwind at the end of the day by firing his pistol off the deck. Now, the drum was another submarine that I wrote about, and you guys have part of the drum actually right out front there, I noticed when I was pulling in earlier. Like the Silversides, the drum served the whole war, sinking a total of 15 ships. What interested me about the drum was this young man, Mike Renskoff. He started the war off as a junior officer on board the drum, and he would work his way up to becoming its skipper. And he did that at the ripe old age of 26. He was the youngest skipper of a fleet boat in World War II. But he was the product of the drum. They made him who he was because he had started there right before the attack on Pearl Harbor. He'd worked his way up. He was a homegrown skipper. And like many others, being out at sea, he would miss the birth of his own son. This is actually the telegram from his family papers. It says that he got 6 weeks later when he pulled back into port that his son had been born. And another thing that interested me about the drum is a larger unknown story about World War II that doesn't get a lot of coverage, but it's the issue of hell ships. And I don't know how many people might be familiar with those. In the end stages of the war, when Japan was losing, they began to take POWs that they had captured over the years, and they were transporting them off of islands like the Philippines and places like that, and they were putting them in cargo ships and sending them back to Japan to help dig air raid shelters, work in mines, and things like that. And so hell ships weren't marked like you would mark a hospital ship like this, for instance, with a cross on it. So you would, to a bombardier looking through his eyepiece, to a skipper looking through a periscope, there's nothing to distinguish this ship as being filled with POWs. And they carried thousands of POWs, including the one that the Arison Maru, which had 1,800 American POWs on board. When it set out in late October 1944 as part of a 12-ship convoy, leaving the Philippines and going up to Taiwan. There were so many men packed on board that one of the men from the Arison Maru later said it was kind of like trying to put marbles in a glass jar. Even though marbles will move around and all that, you finally get so many in the jar, like none move. And so anyway, so it sets off 12 ships that are leaving there. And at this point, the United States has pushed the Japanese so far back up, and that we've run out of all this territory for our submarines. We've built so many of them that they're now operating in wolf packs. And just like the name implies, they're hunting in tandem, in groups of them, so that they can come after a convoy and they can hit it over and over and over again. And so that night in October, this convoy Mata 30 leaves, and it's heading up there, 12 ships. And there's a wolf pack full of American submarines out there, including the drum. And they attack it all night long. They're going after ship after ship. So at sunrise, all that's left out of those 12 ships are 3. And one of those is the Arison Maru with its precious cargo of 1,800 Americans. And so it manages to make it from that morning all the way through that afternoon until the Shark II arrives on the scene. Everybody else has run out of ammunition except the submarine Shark that's come on. And it fires 2 torpedoes that tear open the sides of the Arison Maru. Now, these POWs, these Americans that have been on board, they've been so starved over the years during their experience as prisoners of war that when the ship's torpedoed and the Japanese jump in the lifeboats and head off and leave them on board this soon-to-be sinking ship, first thing these men do, rather than think about getting in a lifeboat and getting off, they ransack the pantry. They eat the ketchup and the mustard, anything they can. The ship does sink later that night. All the men end up in the water. The Japanese pick up 4, and then they use long poles to push the other survivors back away from the destroyers, and they leave. So 1,800 men are in the water. They get 4. A handful of these men end up getting into one of the abandoned lifeboats, and they're exhausted, they're worn out, they spend the night there. The next morning they look over the side, and what happens to float by? A sail. And they're 200 miles from China at this point, and they find this sail, and one of the guys had grown up in Nantucket. He knew how to sail, and they sailed for 2 days and made it to China. And so out of that 1,800 American POWs, 9 survived. That was it. And and you don't hear about that. You hear about the Titanic, you hear about the Lusitania, but you don't hear about the Arison Maru, which more Americans died on that than either of those two ships. And the last boat I focused about was the Tang. And it was skippered by Dick O'Kane, and he's pictured here on the left with Mush Morton there on the right. Now, Mush Morton is one of the most fascinating characters of World War II, particularly the submarine force. He earned his nickname because he resembled the cartoon character Mushmouth. And you can see he's got this big jaw there, and let's see if you can see it there. But he liked to show off for his buddies by putting 4 golf balls in his mouth at one time. But he was this really larger-than-life character. He was an amazing athlete at the Naval Academy, and he was a wrestler. And so he understood that by fighting, if you were going to fight and you were going to win, you needed to get in on your opponent. You needed to pull them close and take them down. And he applied that philosophy early in the war as the skipper of the Wahoo to submarine fighting. And American submarine skippers early in the war, a lot of them, unlike Creed Burlingame was not one, but a lot of his contemporaries at that time period were pretty timid. They were worried that the Japanese could see them. They weren't sure how camouflaged they were. They were a lot more timid. And Mush Morton threw that out the window. He said, no, if we're going to fight, we're going to get right up on these ships. We're going to grapple with them. And he did. And he very quickly became one of the most successful submarine skippers in the war. And he became this big national celebrity. The newspapers loved him. They wrote feature stories about him. In fact, they dubbed him in the press at the time the maker of Jap widows. And he was this really bravado kind of guy, used impolitic language. He would say things like, the only good Jap is a dead Jap, and things like that. And of course, the American public loved it. But he personally was a lot more, was a much more three-dimensional, a much more human character. In fact, his family donated his personal papers to the Bofin Museum in Hawaii. And so when I was doing my research, I had to go out there and check them out. And so, but they've never been used before. And so in reading through them, so even though he had this outsized personality and whatnot, he actually wrote to his dad one time. He said, Dad, he said, take good care of my family for me if something happens. You know it is for such a grand family that I fight so hard. And so he went on. Dick O'Kane was his executive officer. Dick O'Kane gets transferred off to become the skipper of a new boat, the Tang, that's being finished in Mare Island. Mush Morton is almost becomes so big that he's trying to live up to the legend that he's become. And he wrote a letter to his family. He said, I will continue to fight the Wahoo as I have in the past, and when I begin to slow up, I will turn her over to some kid with better nerves than I have. Sadly, he did not take his own advice. And the Wahoo was found, it was caught by the Japanese up off of Hokkaido in water that was too shallow to dive too deep, and and they got him. And Dick O'Kane refused to believe it. He refused to believe the press accounts that Wahoo was overdue and presumed lost, so much so that when Tang was ready to put to sea, he got on board in California, went straight to Hawaii, goes to Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood's office and goes there and he demands to know. He says, is it true? Did they get him? And they did. And so he sets off to fight the Tang to avenge, if you will, his best friend. And avenge he did. Dick O'Kane sunk 24 ships that we know of, and he did it in 9 months. He averaged a ship sunk for every 10 days he was on patrol. He destroyed more ships than any other skipper in World War II. In one of his famous events, he even helped rescue 22 downed airmen during airstrikes off truck, and that landed him in the pages of Life magazine. They actually used a float plane from the battleship North Carolina that would water taxi in, put these guys all on the wings, bring them back out, and O'Kane would pick them up. In fact, submarines over the course of the war would go on to rescue 504 airmen that had been downed. But O'Kane's good fortune ran out in October 1945. Tang was operating off of the Formosa Strait, which is that area off of what's now Taiwan, between Taiwan and China. And he'd been out there for 5 patrols, and they were he'd gotten Lockwood to agree that after this patrol he could go back to San Francisco, have a long time, a refit period, let his men have some time down, go see their wives, their girlfriends and all, once they finish this patrol. So they've now carried 24 torpedoes, they've fired 23. They've got this crippled Japanese ship out here that they've just got to go in and finish off. And so he's up on top, and they can see, they fight at night a lot of times so that they can sort of under the cover of darkness. And so he's up there, and he fires his last shot, his last torpedo, and he sees instantly he's got a problem. He's got a major problem. It's dark, but even in the darkness, he can still see enough to see that his torpedo is starting to porpoise. It's coming out of the water, just like a porpoise. And from the phosphorescence, he can see the wake that it's leaving behind. And he sees that this torpedo, it's boomeranging back around toward him. And you have to remember, he's going at about the speed of a jogger at this point, just a few knots. And he's skippering a submarine that's the length of a football field. And it only takes 12 seconds for that torpedo to arm. And so he's desperately trying to fishtail the submarine out, but it's simply impossible. And that torpedo, his own torpedo, comes back around and strikes the stern of the Tang. And so on board, men seconds earlier who were shouting hooray, getting ready to go back to San Francisco, now suddenly find water's filling up. The ship, it's blown the deck plates up, whatnot. They start sealing down the hatches, the watertight hatches. The men in the back are killed. The men farther forward, the water, they manage to seal the water doors. The Tang swings down like a pendulum, and the bottom hits comes to rest on the seafloor 180 feet down. O'Kane and the guys that are up on the deck outside are in the water at this point. They're alive. And so the men, submarines have an escape chamber that they can use. And so they decide that the men who are still stuck on board, that the best way for them to get out is if they level the boat so it'll come to rest flat on the bottom, and then they can use that escape chamber. So let all the air out of the ballast tanks, and the Tang makes its final dive down to the bottom. Now, several dozen men are still alive at this point, 180 feet underwater, and their boat is on fire. So even though they're underwater, it's burning, and the battery cells are burning, and the acrid smoke is seeping in, even into watertight compartments. It's seeping in through some of the vent pipes and things of that nature. And so they gather all up in the front, and they start trying to make this escape out, to get out. And so once they go up into this chamber, they then flood it up with water, mostly all the way up, and they open the side door, and they release a buoy that goes up with a rope, and then they can follow that rope up at the height of an 18-story building to get some perspective. And so that night, some of the men get out. Most of them don't. A lot of them are overcome. The fumes, the oxygen ratios is dwindling, the fumes, it's getting hot down there, it's smoky, and they give up. But 9 men got off of the Tang out of a crew of 87. 9 men, and including O'Kane, the skipper. And those men get picked up the next day by the Japanese, and they spend the remaining 10 months of the war in POW camps. And submarine sailors who end up as POWs were treated very harshly by the Japanese because they were so good at their jobs, and the Japanese knew it. And so they ended up, if anybody's read Unbroken, you may be familiar with Ofuna. The Tang men ended up there with, Zamperini had been there. And in fact, he writes about, this is Suehara Kitamura, who's known as the Butcher of Ofuna. This is his photo from the National Archives. Bill Liebold, who's one of the sailors on board the Tang, ended up having to be his assistant. And he's talked about how Kitamura, rather than use the bandages and stuff like that to help treat injured POWs, would actually use them instead to wipe down and clean his samurai sword. The men developed dysentery and beriberi. Basically they're starving to death. Their body weights at the time at the end of the war were all less than 100 pounds. They would go, literally, some of them would go weeks without bowel movements. So much so that when the war finally ends in August 1945, Dick O'Kane is literally, they think, on his deathbed. He weighs in his 90s. But he and the other members of the Tang were actually taken on board the hospital ship Benevolence in Tokyo Bay, and he did recover. He made this is him on board the Ozark. Later in life, he would come down with Alzheimer's, and before he died, he was constantly saying to his wife, they lived out in California by the coast, and he was constantly trying to walk back out into the waves, and he kept saying, I've got to go get my men. I've got to go get my men. Over the course of the war, American submarines attacked 4,000 Japanese merchant ships, fired 15,000 torpedoes. We sank a confirmed 1,100 merchant ships and 201 known warships. It included a battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. By the end of the war, we had so crippled the Japanese economy, they were so out of fuel, that their battleships were just parked in port, relegated to anti-aircraft duty. So these monsters could do little more than help protect against incoming bomber attacks. The shortage of fuel led to kamikaze attacks because it was just, you didn't have the fuel to train them. So you just taught one guy navigation and everybody else followed. And the civilian population was equally as affected. At the end of the war, many of them were actually left eating a little more than sawdust and things of that nature. But it came at a very steep price. America lost 52 boats, 1 out of every 5. But the war, and this is a quote actually, and I'll end with this. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, this was from their final report, said the war against shipping was perhaps the most decisive factor in the collapse of the Japanese economy and the logistics support of the Japanese military and naval power. So that ends my presentation, and I will add, in case you guys didn't notice, I have a new book coming out next month. So if you like what you heard, think about it. Do a little raid next month. But thank you.